After nearly a year of waiting, Britain has now entered into negotiations with the rest of the European Union about its future within the European Union, or more properly, outside the European Union. This is the beginning of the Brexit negotiations. 2 years from March the 31st of this year, which was the point where Prime Minister Theresa May said Brexit negotiations would start, there's a 2-year deadline now. But really, they have to have this finished within the next 18 months to make it practical. Issues under negotiation will be sovereignty, trade, and immigration, and they're all very touchy subjects. On top of that, May has just held a general election in which she didn't quite lose, but she certainly didn't win, and she's in a weak position. She may not be Prime Minister when the talks are finished. We'll have to wait and see about that. But with me right now, I'm going to talk to one of the experts on Brexit, Professor Anand Menon of King's College London. Anand, if you'd like to join us. Anand, can you tell us some stuff about Brexit? Can you tell us what Brexit is and what the significance of the negotiations which started on Monday are?
Well, what Brexit is both incredibly simple and incredibly complicated. Simple because it means Britain leaves the European Union. But the problem we have is that the referendum gave the British people a choice. You stay in or you leave. What it didn't do was allow us to decide how to leave. And you can leave in lots of ways. You can leave completely and utterly, and then our trade with the European Union is regulated by WTO rules. You can leave a little bit, so you can be like Norway and in the single market. You can leave the single market and stay in the customs. There are all sorts of alternatives. And what we're thrashing about with now in this country is a debate about what Brexit means. The government has a very clear view, which is what people refer to as a hard Brexit. We leave the single market, we leave the customs union. But many people in Parliament have a different view. And what you were just saying about Theresa May's lack of a majority might come back to haunt her as we start parliamentary debates over what Brexit should be.
And I mentioned earlier that there are several issues in here. What's the issue of sovereignty for Brexit?
Well, sovereignty covers a load of things, and it's not a heading in the Brexit negotiations. I mean, broadly speaking, there are two clumps of negotiations. There is what people here call the divorce. What that means is tying up the loose ends of membership, dealing with how much money we owe, dealing with what happens to EU citizens here, dealing with things like that. And then there'll be a negotiation about a trade deal. What sort of trade should we have with the European Union after we leave? And in the first instance, it's the Article 50 or divorce talks, which are what we're going to be doing. And there are three issues. EU citizens in the UK, how much money we owe the European Union, and finally what happens to the border between the north and the south of Ireland.
And you mentioned trade. Do we have any idea what the British government might aim for with trade? And what would the European Union stance be on any trade deal with the UK? Are there any obstacles?
There are always obstacles when it comes to Brexit and when it comes to dealing with the European Union. But we know already from before the election that Theresa May wanted us to leave the single market and leave the customs union. We're pretty certain that's still what the government wants, but of course the government is divided, the Conservative Party is divided, and the Conservative Party doesn't have a majority. So that may change, but at the moment we have to assume, I think, that Brexit means what Theresa May said before the election. Out of the single market, out of the customs union. Now, the European Union has no problem with that. I mean, they'd rather we weren't leaving, but if we want to leave, then they'll let us leave. What they won't do is make exceptions to their rules. So they won't, for instance, if we say we're going to be outside the single market, let us trade with them as if we were inside the single market. So this is going to seriously impact on our levels of trade with the EU.
And we also talked just a moment ago about immigration. That seems to be quite a big issue. Was that something that was influential in setting off Brexit? And what are the issues for immigration that Britain and the EU will talk about?
Well, I think most people now agree that immigration was the dominant issue during the referendum. It was, the vast majority of people who thought immigration into the UK is too high voted for Brexit. What happens now, we still don't know. We have to wait for the negotiations to start. We are going to opt out of freedom of movement, which is the great European right of all citizens to go and work in any country they want. But the government has given no indication of what it wants to replace free movement with. And it's perfectly conceivable that actually we reduce it with a scheme that means every bit as many Europeans come here as before. There are some people who were in favour of Brexit who'd said, we don't mind if immigration remains the same level. We just want to be in control of it. There were other people who supported Brexit who absolutely wanted to cut migration. And that, again, is a debate that we're going to have, and the government's going to have to formulate a line.
I've spoken to the leading business bodies here, Confederation of British Industry, amongst others, and they've mentioned that they would like something called transition. Now, what is transition?
Well, transition refers to the fact, as you said, Article 50 gives us 2 years. We have till March 2019 to sign everything up, then we leave. Most people think there's no way we'll get a trade deal between now and then. So what they want is a system whereby we continue trading as we are now for an unspecified amount of time after the Article 50 negotiations to give us more time to sign up to the trade deal that we need.
Now, Prime Minister May held a general election on June the 8th, which didn't work out too well for her. She lost a majority. She's now a minority government. Is that likely to have any impact on Brexit? Does it make it more or less probable?
I think it's going to make a difference because along with negotiating with the EU, the British government has to pass a load of legislation through Parliament to make Brexit work. And that requires her to win the votes. So I think the lack of a majority will prove to be pretty important when it comes to the Brexit process, yes.
So she feels like a weakened Prime Minister. Two of her own cabinet ministers say they supported her, but an influential commentator on the Conservative side of politics said that she should go. Is it important whether she lasts or not?
Yeah, of course it's important because having to change Prime Minister halfway through the process loses us more time. It'll take the Conservatives a few months to get a new leader, have an election and all that sort of thing. In that time we're in limbo, and of course the Article 50 clock is still ticking. So in that sense stability might be good. If she doesn't enjoy the support of her Parliament and of her Cabinet, however, there's no point in her staying.
And our final question, is there any likelihood of a second referendum on EU membership?
Well, what the last year in politics has taught me is that I should never say never. But I think it's very, very unlikely, not least because it's impractical. We have 2 years. We have 2 years in which we have to do the negotiations, get the outcome ratified. Trying to squeeze a referendum into that process strikes me as being very, very hard indeed.
Anna Manon, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Matthew Elliott, you're Senior Fellow here at the Legatum Institute in London. You were quite heavily involved in Brexit referendum last year. So could you tell us, what does Brexit mean and what is the significance of the negotiations open between UK government and the EU, which started on Monday?
Well, Brexit is all about Britain leaving the European Union. And last year, back in June 2016, Britain voted to leave, and it's basically taken a full year to actually do all the preparatory work ready. So setting up 2 new government departments, the Department for Exiting the EU and also the Department for International Trade, and also Parliament triggering, giving the Prime Minister the right to trigger Article 50, the exit clause of the EU, and actually working out the precise negotiating position, what sort of relationship we want Britain to have with the EU going forward. That's taken a whole year. And now we're starting the negotiations. We've got just under 2 years left on the clock, and Britain will leave by March 2019.
The Brexit campaign, your Vote Leave organisation, were they in favour of types of immigration into the UK for workers?
We had a very simple policy at Vote Leave. It was called controlled migration. So we didn't want no migration, but we wanted a system whereby the UK government, accountable to elected politicians in Parliament, were the ones who would decide the type of migration we want to the UK. I found it really interesting talking to people right across the country during the campaign, and no one said they didn't want any migration. And actually lots of people in the very strong leave areas of the country recognise the fact that we need to have the best and the brightest skilled workers from right across the world coming to work and live in the UK. And also we need some unskilled workers as well, because for the economy to grow, we need a mixture of workers. But the key thing that people wanted was for politicians to actually determine ahead of time the sort of migration we wanted, rather than us being open to an open door, untrammelled, uncontrolled migration policy.
One of the aspects of leaving the European Union is going to be trade between the UK and the EU.
Yeah.
What kind of trade agreement do Brexiteers favour?
Well, we want a full and comprehensive EU-UK trade deal. one that will give the UK companies full access to the rest of the EU, and also companies in the EU give them access to the British market, because we shouldn't forget that the UK is the biggest export destination for the rest of the EU. So they have a big interest in wanting to sell goods and services to consumers in the UK as well. So I'm fairly confident that because at the moment there are zero tariffs and zero quotas between the UK and the rest of the EU, that should be a fairly straightforward trade negotiation to take place over the course of the next few years.
And turning to domestic politics, Prime Minister Theresa May has been weakened by the general election result, which was indecisive. Does that make Brexit more or less likely, or is it irrelevant to Brexit?
Well, in some ways she was weakened because she lost seats in the House of Commons. But we shouldn't forget that as a percentage of the vote, she got 42.5% of the vote. That's a bigger margin than Tony Blair got in 1997 when he became Prime Minister, when he got a huge landslide. So in a sense, it's a slight quirk of the British electoral system that she didn't do so well. But from the Brexit point of view, the most important fact is that both of the major parties, the Conservatives and the Labour Party, both had in their manifesto the sort of clean Brexit that I'm talking about, of leaving the single market and leaving the customs union and taking back control over migration. So really, 85% of voters in the UK voted for this form of Brexit, which the government's enacting. So for me, that's the most important part of the mandate.
A leading conservative commentator on a website called Conservative Home has called for the Prime Minister to go, and the former Chancellor of the Exchequer said the same thing. Does it matter if she stays or if she goes?
Well, for me, I focus really on Brexit and making sure that Brexit happens. That's the number one priority for me. I don't really take part in party politics. At the moment, it seems like she has the support of MPs in the House of Commons within her own party. They don't feel any sense there's a need to have a leadership election or a change of Prime Minister now. I think that the public are frankly sick and tired of having elections. They had an election in 2015, the referendum in 2016, another election this year in 2017. So I don't feel there's any appetite for a change of Prime Minister and another election, while she still has the confidence of MPs, which she currently does.
Excuse me, sir. We're from Chinese television. We're asking people what they think of Brexit because the Brexit negotiations have started.
Okay.
Would you like to tell us what you think of Brexit?
Yeah, okay, sure.
Okay. So, Brexit, what does it mean to you?
To me, I still regret that we're going ahead with it. I voted to remain. It was not just a bureaucratic thing. I felt European. I identified that way. And so for that reason, I regret it happening. However, I'm kind of thinking now it would be impossible to fully overturn the decision, or there's, too much has happened now too much has been entered upon. So I don't know. I'm just sort of stuck, just hoping it will happen as well, as cleanly as possible. Not as cleanly. That suggests a hard Brexit. Sort of as gently as possible.
What would you like to see from Brexit?
Personally, I'd like to see a sort of deal where we stay within the single market and we keep free movement, but there's some debate, and I genuinely don't know how compatible that is with actually leaving the EU at all. I've heard so many different things. I'm confused as to what actually that leaves.
Do you live and work in London?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
London's quite a Remain kind of place. Do you think it's still a Remain place?
Yeah, I think so. I think, though, I do get a sense that there's just around the country a kind of grim acceptance. But maybe that's a sort of confirmation bias, because that's kind of how I feel.
That's great. Thank you very much for your time.
No problem. Yeah.
Cheers.
Okay.
See you around. Hello, we're from Chinese television. We're asking people what they think about Brexit. Would you want to tell us what you thought about Brexit?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So, what does Brexit mean to you?
I think it means a fundamental change in the European Union and really for the world from this point on. And I think the negotiations are going to take a long time, but I don't know. We'll have to see what the final result is.
Do you think it would be a good thing for Britain and a good thing for the EU, or a bad thing?
I think in the short term, it'll be. I'm actually taking international political economy here at LSE. I think in the short term, after all the negotiations are made, I think it'll be a good thing for England. But in the long term, I don't think it'll be a good thing. But I think they will have some benefits. I mean, the obvious ones, they don't have to pay all that money into the European Union, and they can make their own trade deals. They could enforce their own borders and immigration laws. But in the long term, we'll just have to see. I don't know.
You're a student here now. Imagine that this was post-Brexit Britain. Would it be easier to be a student, or better, or harder, or worse to be a student?
Well, I'm an American, so I don't know if it would have any impact on me as an American. Maybe as a student from another country, it may be harder to get visas and things like that. But as far as being a student here, I don't know. I think it would change. I think it has changed a lot of thought here, especially among academics. A lot of professors now are talking about economic nationalism. That's what we talked about today, actually, as a viable concept. And serving as enforcing your own trade policies. So I think it's going to change academic institutions. I don't know about affecting how I would study. I think that would probably stay the same.
Well, you mentioned economic nationalism, and the past 30 years,
Right.
perhaps a little longer, have been about a kind of globalism and a
Right.
kind of free trade. Is Brexit a challenge to that? And will it affect other countries
yeah.
that might want free trade?
Absolutely. I think it's a challenge to globalism. I think globalism has negatively affected some people, in the United States, people in blue-collar areas, in the United Kingdom, people mostly in the north who have more blue-collar jobs, factory jobs. And I think it was really a pushback on that because it has benefited, I think, the world as a whole. But I think that it has negatively affected a lot of people, and I think it was definitely a big pushback on globalism. And I don't know if this nationalist trend will continue. I know a lot of elections in Europe have been anti-nationalist after post-Brexit, so I don't know if it'll continue, but I think it definitely was a pushback on that.
That's great. Very succinct. Thank you very much. And sir, could I ask you what you think of Brexit?
As an American, I don't know if there's a whole lot to weigh in on because, it is fundamentally a choice on, I suppose, the degree to which Britons want to retain absolute versus attenuated sovereignty. And so I think that's fundamentally a choice that couldn't be made by anyone but Britons, and I guess they made their choice.
Were you here when the choice was made, the Brexit vote, June 23 last year?
No, I wasn't.
Were you in the States at the time?
Yes.
What did it look like from the States?
It was publicized, and a lot of people were talking about it, but I wouldn't say it was a number one priority.
And what was people's opinion about it, if they even bothered to have an opinion in the States?
I think that certainly people who are more attuned to current events and global policy were much more opinionated on the matter than, I would say, the average person. I don't know if the average person had such a strong opinion on it. Certainly in academics, there were a lot of strong opinions on it, and I would say by and large, the vast majority of those in academia were opposed to Brexit. And certainly, I'm in university, and certainly most of the people I was around were opposed to it.
Awesome. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we've asked a few people in this central part of London, and London in the Brexit referendum was very pro-Remain. But what we're finding on the streets is that people are accustomed to Brexit now. Brexit negotiations are going ahead, and there doesn't seem to be any call for a referendum. But it's not clear what the Brexit deal will be. And people aren't sure what the negotiating stance is, and they don't know what the final outcome will be. So over the past year, people have said there's a great deal of uncertainty, and that uncertainty continues. And I suppose the only certainty is that negotiations have started. It isn't absolutely certain that the UK will leave the European Union. The European Union itself has said, you can stay, but the UK looks set on the path to go.